Is time series data crushing your database performance? InfluxDB handles millions of data points per second with a database built specifically for time series workloads. Thousands of developers have already switched for faster, real-time insights. Ready to see the difference? Visit influxdata.com today.
Hello everybody, I'm InfoQ Pop, an InfoQ editor, and today I have in front of me Brian Fox, CTO and co-founder of Sonatype. Hello Brian, if you can introduce yourself. I know that you are very involved with open source, so I'll just allow you to choose the accolades that you want to bear because you have plenty.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me. So yes, I'm Brian Fox, as you mentioned, co-founder, CTO at Sonatype. If you haven't heard of Sonatype, Sonatype runs the Maven Central repository. We're also the producers of Nexus and a lot of other software that people tend to know. I got started in open source a long time ago. Most of my open source street credentials, if you will, comes from the Maven project. I was a contributor early on. I was the PMC chair for a number of years. I'm still on the PMC, but haven't written any code there in a while. I work with the Apache Infra to run some of that stuff. And more recently, I've been on the governing board of the Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF. And I'm also on the board of the Finos Financial Open Source Foundation. And through those efforts in recent years, I did work with different governments, helping out with some of the national cybersecurity draft. And over the last couple of years over in Europe with the cyber resiliency, the CRA work. So that's what I've been up to.
Thank you for the help with the CRA. I know that you are quite involved with that. You are one of the people that pushed and rang the alarm when you felt that it will just put the open source in Europe, at least, in danger. How about now? Are you happy with the outcome? I know that people felt that they listened, but how do you feel?
That's a Pandora's box, isn't it? So for listeners that might not be fully aware, the CRA was attempting to put obligations on open source, treat it like commercial software, which is generally, I think, directionally correct, right? The problem, and this is something that I've been pushing on for years and years, is that organizations use open source software, but they don't track it. They don't know what's going on. So when something like Log4j happens, they have no idea what's inside their software. And, there's like a collective freak out. And, this is a problem that I've been helping organizations with for almost 2 decades by building services and products for them to do this. And so I think the CRA maturation is generally good. The problem was in the drafting, they were trying to close loopholes. Like they literally said they were worried that organizations would get around the penalties by open sourcing their software, which I'm not sure that's something we should be worried about, right? If like a big commercial enterprise is willing to open source their software, why would we not think that's a good thing? But they did. And so in the result, they tried to define commercial and tried to put obligations on open source producers, which without specific carve-outs or exceptions could have meant that individuals who were writing software anywhere in the world could be held liable for significant security vulnerabilities in software that they had no control over. So if you wrote a library and somebody included it into, a car, and it was a self-driving car and it killed some people because of a bug in your software, you might be held liable, even though you didn't know that your open source was being used in a car. And so it's sort of one of these cases of you take a good idea, but you try to go too far and it can create some backlash. And there was also some early language that kind of made it the situation where Sonatype, as the company running the Maven Central, where all the world's open source Java libraries are, were suddenly on the hook for the security of literally everything being transmitted through it. And so what I was kind of standing up and shouting to anybody that would listen a few years ago is like, listen, this is good, but what Europe is about to do is basically box themselves off from the rest of the world. Because if you're not an EU citizen and you're writing open source, I don't have to comply with your laws. I can change my license to say you can't use it anymore in Europe. Is that what you really want? Do you really want to have to find your own forks of Linux and literally everything because open source users worldwide basically carve you out? And currently, the only places where you kind of have to restrict your open source, at least as a US citizen, is North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And did Europe really want to add themselves to that list by saying that you can't have access to open source? And further, do you want to put yourself in a situation where providers of open source infrastructure like Maven Central would be forced to block it for Europe, lest we become liable for literally every bug in every piece of open source Java? It was insane. Fortunately, it took a long time, but people listened and they made some exceptions to make it more clear that that wasn't the target. So when the legislation passed, I would say I was content, maybe not happy after the battle. In the interim, it has become problematic. The way these standards get created, right? The legislation called for the definition of standards around a lot of different things. And there are standards bodies, specifically ones that operate within Europe, and they're used to working in a very commercial sense. And so like what's actually happening right now is open source is still struggling to be heard in these standards. So, I do feel like I've regressed in my happiness from that contentment to somewhat frustration. And we might backslide because the resulting standards that get defined might in fact actually end up only working for commercial entities, because that's literally the only people who have input to that process right now. And I'm sure people would take issue with that statement, but that's what I see unfolding. And I'm still in a number of meetings where this is like the conversation that happens nearly every week. So We'll see.
It feels that the CRA was a battle ever since it started, and it was an ongoing process. And in the end, the compromise, or the point that it got to, it was decent and pretty much okay with open source supporters. But now, as it starts in the execution phase and its implementation, I think it will come in full force 2 years from now. The commercial entities are being heard rather than having an open table where you discuss with everybody, including open source representatives. And that's the biggest danger at this particular point of time, especially as we hear a lot of sovereign in conversations also when it comes about cloud, for instance. It's a lot of the things that were being pushed. What I was surprised to see now with Open Source Summit, but also in spring with QCon Europe, there was a lot of discussion about sovereign cloud, the Linux Foundation EU, and as you said, you see that the factions are being created rather than moving towards the common goal. So we should be worried about what happened and just keep our eyes and try to act as a group, because we as consumers, we need to understand and make sure that it's in our best interest.
Yeah, it is a very slippery slope, and I haven't heard of any recently, but there were some open source projects not long after the CRA, was signed, that basically withdrew all of their open source from the market because they were basically saying, I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell that I'm not culpable here. I'm not committing to providing 5 years of support on all of my stuff. So effective immediately, I revoke all of my open source. So it is a true statement that at least some people have pulled back their open source, not just from Europe, but for the whole world, because they can't understand the implications of this. So, it is a real thing. It's not just fear mongering. How bad it will be is still to be determined, I think.
Yeah, what you can see in the last period is that software is coming of age. People really understand where it happens. But in comparison with the rest of the infrastructure, I don't know, let's think about electrical infrastructure or gas infrastructure. Software has the added value and the added ability of being able that a group of people around the globe can act as providers, as infrastructure builders. But nobody will just go and build their own electrical power grids and open source and just allow it. So that's I think the advantage, but also the problem with what we have. Mm-hmm. So going towards that, I saw that during the Open Source Summit, there was a lot of discussion. The Linux Foundation discussed a lot about what happens in the open source space. Everybody knows and saw the report that said that 90+% of the software around it's open source. Now, Frank Nagel is part of the Linux Foundation, and he will continue this effort, especially in the AI age. Then there were reports that they provided talking about commercial open source and companies like, MongoDB or others that are also taking money from their paid products, but they provide also open source licensing model. So it's an interesting day. What's on your plate these days? Because I have to go always during the autumn times and I'm waiting for the open source report that you're putting, the state of the open source. 10 years from now, I think this year will be the 11th.
This year is the 11th. Yeah. So every year we do the state of the software supply chain security report. We have shifted it to Q1. So it'll be a wintertime thing this year for the 11th. It actually started that way in the beginning, and somehow we slowly shifted into the fall. But so we'll be working on it. We're going to be looking a lot at, AI, agentic AI, how that intersects with open source governance and stuff like that. I've written on that on several blog posts lately, if you're curious in where we're thinking about that. But that work is coming. In addition to that, I've been speaking and writing a lot about the sustainability of open source infrastructure. That I think is an interesting topic. Everybody's used to thinking about open source sustainability, and everybody's head probably goes to pay the maintainers, have your developers contribute all the code, right? Yes, you should do all those things. By and large, most people don't. There's nothing new there. What has really been flying under the radar and not enough people really pay attention to it is all of the infrastructure that all of the open source production depends upon these days. So these are things like Maven Central that Sonatype pays for. We run it like it's a charity. We're not a not-for-profit, but we treat this part of it historically like it's a charity. And so do basically most of the other package registries, and a lot of other open source infrastructure is the same, right? So it's donated for open source. It's donated to support open source. Take your pick. All the hyperscalers, they provide credits to projects and things like this. Everybody's doing it. But by and large, they're all operating like charities. There's no balancing of the consumption and the costs, right? And so, I started digging into this early last year in 2024, precisely because I was having conversations with hyperscalers and others about trying to figure out a better model. Because when I look at our data in Maven Central, 80% of the traffic is coming from one of the big three cloud providers in the US, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So their customers collectively produce 80% of the bandwidth that Sonatype pays for. So, there are conversations to be had about what do you do about that? These are scalers. They have obviously better rates for bandwidth than I can negotiate. But that conversation led to things like, well, okay, nobody wants to sign up for an open bill to just pay unlimited bandwidth. What are you doing to curb the abuse? Then nobody ever really asked me that before. And it's somewhat ironic because everybody thinks that, there's just a bigger fish. They will always just step in and write an unlimited check for these things. And the answer is they won't. In fact, most of these companies are, in fact, the sponsors in almost every open source foundation, including the ones I'm a part of and all these things. So they are giving back, right? But nobody wants to sign up for running a service that has to be run indefinitely and is critical infrastructure that is just growing unbounded. So when I started digging into it, I found that the consumption patterns were massively lopsided. That I forget the exact number. It was somewhere also in the ballpark of 80% of the traffic was coming from less than 1% of the individual IPs worldwide, right? So it was massively skewed towards a handful of really heavy users. So we had to do some work to put in place some sensible throttling to try to get this under control. And with open source things like this, you have to approach it carefully because people are used to getting a free ride forever. And so you have to be benevolent in your actions in changing that, right? So that led down a journey that went from looking at individual IPs to looking at organizational consumption. So what I was finding was that there were very large non-cloud organizations that were downloading stuff from us across thousands of IP numbers. And in some instances, downloading the same set of 10,000 jars 500,000 times every 2 weeks. That's kind of ridiculous, right? And so it's why is that happening? And that led me to go a little bit further, and I uncovered further, I wouldn't necessarily call it abuse, but I would say decisions made by other tools in the ecosystem by companies that don't pay the bill, looking at all of this stuff as just free infrastructure. And it is the classic case of, what we say in the tragedy of the commons, when nobody is really sees who's paying for the thing, then waste ensues. And so I've been on a journey down that path for a long time. And it turns out and talking to other open source infrastructure providers, other package registries and what have you, everybody is carrying this burden at the moment. We're having conversations about how we can change that dynamic a little bit, because none of this is sustainable to run it as an indefinite, unlimited, unbounded charity.
That's for sure true. But that's something that you as a company are supporting, and everybody takes it for granted. And if you look at the big players, you mentioned the big three cloud providers, they have 80% of the downloads going towards that direction, but nobody is willing to pay. Or they don't have any intent. They expect it to be like clouds, right? They're in the sky, they are there. We don't care about how they get there and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not so much the clouds that I'm talking about here. It's the users in general. Many of them happen to be on the cloud, which makes my job more difficult because I don't easily have a way to find out who they are. I can't reach out and contact them and ask them to change their behavior or do anything like that. It's somewhat opaque, right? I want to be clear. This is not an indictment of the cloud. The cloud, like I said, they pour tons of money into open source. They're the ones who helped start OpenSSF and the Alpha Omega Fund and Finos and all these other things. But the point is, even in conversations with them, it's hard to align the business and the costs side of things, right? And that's ultimately the problem here, that all of these foundations, and to the extent they're supporting open source infrastructure, they basically just rely on a set of benefactors, i.e. their members, that sign up to support a cause. But I don't think the members are getting into this thinking that, oh, I want to sign up, so a big chunk of my annual dues goes to paying for another Fortune 100 company to download jars 1 million times a month. Like, nobody gets excited about that. But yet that's kind of what's happening, because these foundations rely on member dues to pay their operating costs. And on the flip side, all of the consumers are able to just consume this stuff in an unbounded way, right? So it's a little bit like whether it's a single company, like in the case of Sonatype, paying for Central, or if it's like members of, take your pick, Eclipse, who are paying for the OpenVSX stuff, or the members of the Linux Foundation paying for all the distribution. When the consumption is misaligned with the cost, it creates massive amounts of waste at the end of the day. And so that has to change. And so we're all kind of exploring ways to think about that. Throttling is just part of it. But maybe there's models where if organizations go above a certain expected threshold, they have to pay. Maybe if they're distributing proprietary software, which is the case. I find lots of companies, and I call it the free CDN use case. They're putting stuff in Central. It's clearly proprietary, and they're doing it just because then they don't have to buy or pay for a CDN to distribute their stuff. I don't think anybody would argue that's fair, right?
Yeah.
But they're leveraging the distribution and network effect and all of that. That's great. But if they were paying some, it would help to contribute to it, right? And so I think that's kind of where all this is going, that we need to do a better job of balancing the cost and the consumption. And then some of these things start to work themselves out.
We all like the benefits of open source, especially the part with the open, but it's also about the responsibility. If you use it, you should contribute to that in some way. If you're not able to contribute, I don't know, money, time, or whatever, it would be nice to see how you use it, probably the patterns, the way how you interact with repositories or package managers. It's a way. What would be a couple of suggestions for, developers, people that are just using package managers, how they can adapt the way how they interact with this to make your life easier and their life easier in the end?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think by and large, it's not the individual developers that are the problem. Like, they're the ones that we want to be able to have access to this stuff, right? It's massive organizations who are not using a repository manager, for example. And so they're, instead of caching the dependencies they use, every single one of their 10,000, CI jobs, or in the near future, their agentic development tools are spawning off and re-downloading the same jars at this all over the place. And, because it's quote unquote free, right? That's kind of the point that I'm making. So if you're in charge of infrastructure at these organizations, you should be looking closely at how you're using, these open source tools. Just because they're free for you doesn't mean they're free for the world. I kind of equate it to, like burning carbon. It's why the cap and tax is a conceptually useful thing here, because if it's effectively free for you to emit unbounded amounts of carbon, yet all of humanity pays the cost, that's kind of what we're talking about. As soon as you start putting a price on it, then people start thinking, well, maybe those efficiency things actually make sense for me. And so if there's no penalty for you to just download the same components on your cloud all the time because your ingress costs on your cloud are free, then why would you do anything different? And that's the part. It's somewhat invisible, the costs. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. So if you're in charge of the infrastructure, you should be thinking about how your organization is using it. Think about using it more efficiently, contributing to it when these foundations start making changes to their models is probably at some level not going to be optional, but being a champion of it will be helpful. I would go further and say, if you're developing tools that use these services, think carefully about how you're doing it. I was shocked to find that many of these giant companies that were hammering Central were doing so. They even had repository managers, some of them Nexus, but they couldn't effectively use it because of decisions in the build tools they were using made it really, really difficult for them to send their traffic to the repo manager. So they were accidentally doing it. And this was, again, because another company created a build tool that didn't have to pay for Central, so didn't think about making it efficient, right? And we found multiple instances like that. This is why I'm trying to raise the awareness. I don't think, for the most part, anybody is doing this stuff maliciously, but if it's invisible, then we're collectively squandering the resources that we have available to us.
There was a couple of, I think 1 or 2 years back, and there was a carbon almanac being written by a bunch of people around the globe, people that are in business, in marketing, and all kind of points, and then they're just trying to provide a basic understanding for everybody of how important carbon management is. And then they were providing numbers like, okay, a solar panel, it's needed to use carbon when you build it, but then you get to the point where you get to zero in a couple of months, you already used it, and so on and so forth. Yeah. One of the conclusions there, it was about comfort. As you said, it's not malicious, but it's comfortable to just not think about these kind of things. It makes my life easy, and I'm dependent on something that it usually matters. And given the size of software infrastructure these days, we are quite savvy on creating carbon. We are one of the big players, especially with all the AI growing and growing. It's getting worse, and we don't even think about it, and we are doing stupid stuff. An example that I was discussing at some point with Holly Cummins from Red Hat, well, probably IBM now. Some people are just using 4K on their YouTube, listening to music. They are coding, they don't see the video, but they use 4K, and then all the infrastructure behind it.
That's a perfect example. It's the waste. And why do you do that? Well, because it's easy.
Yeah,
and
it's comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I had an example of one person who was basically had their pipeline set up so that every time they committed, it ran through all the tests and all of the continuous stuff. And then it was staging a potential deployment on Maven Central just to run through the validation because one time it failed. So they set it up. And so they're doing this and causing us to have to validate signatures and do all kinds of work when they know they're going to drop it. And they were doing it on every commit. And so I reached out and was like, dude, what are you doing? Like, I get it. And at the end, I told them, I said, listen, if you don't care about wasting Sonatype's money, at least be a better carbon burner for all of us because you're wasting carbon in doing this. This is just ridiculous. And it's those little things. And it was when I pointed it out, they were like, I never thought about that. I thought about it just because it's like it was free. But when you actually think about who's paying for that CI time, it was probably donated time, maybe from GitHub. Maybe they were GitHub Actions, right? Like someone's paying for it. And it's not a free ride.
Yeah, obviously. But let's not expect everybody to think about broadly and understand our pain or your pain in this case. But the only thing that it's going in my mind as somebody that was on top of infrastructure in multiple companies is, how about the risk? What if something happens and you, by mistake, you just unplug Maven Central? My company is reliant on that. And somebody, I don't know, the cleaning lady just stumps in the cable that keeps the server, the Maven Central cable up and running. What happens? I will not do anything because I'm reliant on Maven Central. So then that's one-on-one risk mitigation and the risk management.
That's been the message, of course, as our first product was Nexus, the caching proxy, right? And so like it makes those things faster more reliable. You're less reliant on the internet. And the irony is everybody had those in the early days because Maven Central wasn't on a highly performant CDN. It was donated time from a university in the US. And so it was not uncommon that it would fail for a while. So everybody had to have a repo manager. And so in a weird sort of way, by us investing in more and more expensive infrastructure, we've worked against people using repo managers, right? We made it more reliable and then they didn't feel the need to it. And so this is a classic win-win because if you start doing these things, your builds will get faster, right? You may not care that you're spending money downloading those things, but it still takes time. And it's always going to be faster to pull it from a 10 gig network connection in a machine in your own rack than it is to pull it over the internet every time. That there's just no way around that.
That's for sure. So let me iterate over the potential risks of, I said developers broadly, meaning that people that are consuming that as organization and everything, but because in the end, the developers are the ones that are ringing the alarm bells. They just go to conferences, they listen to things, and then just go to their managers. And then they come with the question, how do I convince my manager to do the right stuff? Well, most of the time, except for the AI, because generative AI convinced all the managers to convince all the developers that they should use generative AI. That was a different pattern. But you mentioned the risk of potentially not having the infrastructure. At some point, the infrastructure is severed. You're out in the cold. You don't have it. Then, obviously, the global warming that is pressing all of us, and we can see that each day. Then the other thing that I was considering is, how about the risk? I particularly looked into the state of the supply chain report that you put together in the last 2 years, and I reported about it, I read about it. And what was interesting is that the supply chain attacks were increasing, I don't know, it was the 3x, 4x,
Yep.
and pretty much everything was what happened in the, I don't know, in the first 3 years of the report, it was probably 5 times more in the other part. I don't remember the numbers, but the scale was
It was
ludicrous.
growing by 700% for multiple years in a row. Yeah.
Yeah. Am I correct when I'm saying that if I would cache inside of my organization, I'll be in a much better place because I'll be able to make sure that I'm in a safer place, what I'm using. I'll not be to something that is open, it's exposed to everybody.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I've been talking about that so long, you can see I don't even talk about it anymore. I feel like it's old news, but it's useful for people to hear it again. What you're talking about is the rise of intentionally malicious open source, right? And we've been talking about that, tracking that, providing solutions for that since at least 2017. I don't know what the latest number is. It's something like 900,000 malicious attacks, and it's going up by thousands every week. And yes, part of the problem is that so much of this stuff depends directly on caching things or fetching things from the repository that the attackers know if they can get something into the repo, they instantly get millions of downloads. Things like NPM and other tools, they prefer the latest. So it doesn't matter. I don't have to put it in there and convince people to upgrade. I just put it in there and the tools fetch it instantly. So being completely online dependent with these things in real time sets you up for a situation where your developers potentially download a malicious component within seconds of it being on the public repo. Tools like Nexus have capabilities that you can put in place to shield your developers from that, right? Because we have information, we analyze these things as soon as they hit public repos, not just Maven Central, all of them, because our customers need all of these things. And we can tell when something is fishy within minutes of them hitting the repo and then can block that from being fetched from the developers. But if you don't have that infrastructure in place, you don't have any of these, firewalls, if you will, that to be able to stop this stuff from coming in. I started this conversation focused on just stop wasting the resources, but you're right. There are these other more traditional angles of it, and it will make you more secure. It will make you faster. And so it's like, why aren't you doing that? Part of the answer is because some of the tools that they're using have made the decision not to prioritize that. Tools like Gradle make it hard to use a repository manager, for example. That's what I've uncovered. I didn't know. I'm a Maven guy, not a Gradle guy, but that's what I learned in this process when I was working with some of these companies trying to curb their behavior. And then they came back and said, yeah, we can't. And so I dug a little deeper and uncovered some of that. We found in one instance, React Native, for example. This is compiling, JavaScript native for mobile phones and things like that. We were finding that what would happen is they'd run an NPM build. That thing would fork off thousands of Gradle builds. Each one of those Gradle builds was fetching the same components over and over again. And worse, because the Gradle files were generated, they couldn't insert the line in there that said, go to my repository manager. So I found one instance of a large company who had 60 developers and not their CI systems. Their CI systems was coming from a different CI space. Just literally the developer machines in their offices, they were creating more traffic to Maven Central than many clouds. Not the big three, but clouds like cable modem providers, which is shocking to think about. But it's not that hard when you actually understand what was happening. One build was like recursively forking tens of thousands of other builds, and each one of those was downloading the same things over and over again. Fortunately, when I reached out to the React team, they made it possible to make changes to tell the React stuff, when you generate the Gradle files, overwrite the URLs to use my repository manager, right? So now it's a case of convincing people to flip those switches, but at least they made the switches. But these are kind of those hidden things, these decisions that nobody thought about that were made and now baked into the tooling that just makes this so much worse, right? So those are some specifics of what we've uncovered, and I'm sure I'll find more.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about all the ecosystem that I know that they were problematic. I know that NPM was one of the worst hit when it was about the malicious open source. PyPy was another one. So are you alone in this battle? Or is it a common front? I'm just thinking now, NPM has a lot of traction. JavaScript is growing a lot. Python these days is growing a lot. Cargo for Rust, again, has a lot of traction with its adoption in the Linux kernel, and obviously being the shiniest tool for the CNCF ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Are you working together, or you're still alone like Gandalf in the dark and then try to bring people together? Or I should leave this question for a later date.
I can say that most of the package managers more recently have gotten together and we've talked about the sustainability problem. Everybody is having the same problem. Everybody is unsure how to approach it with their communities. And so we are working on some kind of a joint statement to kind of give more visibility to this problem on the world. So we are working together on that. There are working groups within the OpenSSF where most, if not all, of the package registries do work on things like checklists for how to make the supply chain more secure, who's implemented MFA, and these types of things for sure. One of the challenges that I think they have, it comes back to these endemic decisions. In Maven, there's the concept of the namespace, the group ID, which borrowed from Java, the reverse DNS of your company's name, makes it a convenient place for us as we manage Central to make sure we validate that you control the namespace that you're trying to publish to. So you either have to have your own domain or you have to use the project domain name of a foundation or GitHub that you're at, right? But we require you to prove it. And that takes a whole set of these malicious attacks off the table because it's much harder for you to pretend to be, org Apache struts than it is if you were just trying to pretend to be struts, right? And it makes it much less likely that somebody would confuse you as the official provider of these things. In these other ecosystems, they don't have the concept of namespaces. NPM added scopes, but it was added after and it's optional. And most things published into the repo don't have one. So now you've removed one piece of metadata that would also have to be faked. It's you remove one factor in the identification, if you will. So you've got that problem, and then there's not the validation of the name because there's not a namespace to tie it to. And so you can easily typo squat popular projects, and then you combine it with what I mentioned before, which, Maven actively discourages you from saying, I want the latest jar. You need to put a version number in, right? And so just because a new version appears in the repo doesn't mean your build is fetching it. You would have to then choose to update and grab it. So we preferred stability over auto updating, which, to be fair, comes at its own costs. For a long time, I was talking about how long people were still running old vulnerable versions of Log4j, right? So there are trade-offs to that decision. But the other side of it is, ecosystems where it's going to fetch the latest unless you tell it not to. That's that ready audience for the attackers. So I think those factors, the ease of pretending to be someone you're not, combined with the audience that's about to fetch this stuff as soon as you can get it out there. I mean, if you were an attacker, why wouldn't you start there? And so I think that's why we see it's very disproportionate. These intentionally malicious components are appearing in those ecosystems. It's not because they're not trying to make it secure. It's that the decisions made in the early design of those tools didn't provide the levers that they really need to do things like what we're able to do with Maven and with Maven Central.
What I was thinking while listening to you is about the OpenSSF scorecards. I found that to be very, very good. And also the tools that are just going over your repositories and it just comes with the score and the suggestions. I know that at some point I spoke to one of the maintainers of an open source library. And after the presentation, he said, okay, well, I learned something new. Well, I was very happy that I can promote that. And probably something that might help people, or I don't know, or maybe on the path towards continuous deployment. There is also this minimal continuousdeployment.org manifesto about how we should do things better. Probably something in that PSK space will help.
Yeah, the push towards continuous everything exacerbates most of the problems I've been talking about, haven't I? And so it's sort of a case of we take things to the extreme, just like the example I was talking about with the publisher staging all the way to central. Making people aware of those will definitely help. And, the other part that I've been trying to shine a light on, because I learned this recently, about a year ago, and it kind of surprised even me that some of these open source projects spend about $60,000 in machine time just to do a single release. And all of that is because all of the integrated testing and all of this kind of stuff, when you're talking about like big distributed databases, distributed file systems, testing that at scale, it's not cheap. That's what some of these open source projects are looking at. It's like, wow, we've moved from a very different place than we were when I started. When I started, I was more or less just donating my time. I already had a computer and an internet connection and electricity, and I just needed time to work on the code, right? And fast forward to where we are today, I think it's more or less frowned upon if you do a release from your personal machine, because who can trust that your machine hasn't been compromised? We like to see things in repeatable, auditable, trackable supply chains. And guess what? Those are all running in the cloud, mostly on donated machine time, right? And that's the part that it's kind of crept up on us and has become invisible. But the expectations the world has on all of these things, they all come at a cost. And so we're now in a situation where, yes, the developers are still contributing their time. And, there are conversations about how they should be compensated for that, of course. But, the light I'm shining on is everything that goes underneath that as well, just not free. And so the more people think about that, I think they will, at least some of them, hopefully, will inevitably start changing their behaviors a little bit to be better overall citizens to recognize that.
That's definitely useful. I mean, there are two options to have more money. One of them is to gain more, and the other one is to be more cautious on how you're spending the money. And if you're choosing both ways of doing it, it's definitely for the best. The way how you mentioned it's definitely be the desired way, that especially big players have better governance and the better way of implementing stuff on their side. And we know that it's not something you'll do from today to tomorrow. And now I'll go back again to the pawns of this big landscape, the developers. Suggestions that will help them make their lives easier, but also your life. How should they start looking at probably the build is the main subject here and the way how they interact? What should they know? I don't know, 3 things, 5 things that you think would be useful for them to do, just to wrap up with an idea.
Make sure that you have a repository manager so that it can cache all of these things. That's true even if you're running in the cloud. Speed of light is still a thing, And further, I would double click on that now and say, and make sure your builds are actually using it. Because this is the thing that I uncovered. People thought they were, and they turns out they weren't. So look closely at the logs. Make sure it is, in fact, downloading from your Nexus or whatever you have. And that would go a long way. And by the way, it's going to make all of your stuff faster. And it might even save you money too, because now you're paying less compute time for all of those build jobs running. You might not pay for the bandwidth, but you're paying for the CPU time while it's sitting there, right? Twiddling its thumbs, waiting for the downloads. These are the common sense things that I think start to help. And then that also, like I said before, provides you that leverage point to start putting protections in place for the malicious open source and things like that, and flip it around. If you are an open source developer or you're developing tools that are leveraging these things, just think carefully about how you're leveraging them. Cache things. Don't rerun stuff every single time just because you can. Back to the way we used to have to write code when we had limited memory, limited CPU. We couldn't infinitely scale it. We had to be a little bit more judicious in what we were doing. Bringing that back, I think, can help a lot here.
Okay, so let's have some embedded development mentality in the cloud space. So more frugality. The cloud providers started already slashing their hundreds of services. So it's about time for us to look at what we have. So before we move, increase the infrastructure, because as you said, it's very easy these days to just go in a console, you just increase it. Out of a sudden, you double the amount of RAM, number of CPUs, and it's a lot easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
Before you do
and I
that,
think we're on the precipice of an explosion with AI because some of these things were self-limited by how many humans you could add to the problem, right?
yep.
Now imagine you can quadruple your development force or more, just like you can dial up your cloud. If you can dial up or down your AI agents, these small inefficiencies now become even more amplified, right? So I think we're on the precipice of seeing some of that. And I know for sure that some of the package managers are struggling with AI-induced loads for that exact reason.
Yeah, so I remain with my statement, which said that AI is a bicycle. If you're just going downhill and you don't wear a helmet, you'll have big problems if you fall. If you're just doing the proper way, it might help you. So before we start using AI chaotically, make sure that we are using our own infrastructure and we know actually what we have there. Okay, anything else, Brian, that we would like to touch upon before we wrap up?
I think we've beat this one to death. Hopefully it's useful for the audience and they learned a thing or two.
Great. I'll just make sure that I touch on the blog post that you mentioned to provide more awareness to everybody. Mm-hmm. Good luck with your battle, with our battle. Thank you for being the champion for the open source community and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.